Christ tells his followers that if they knock, the door will open. If they ask, they'll receive. And if they seek, they'll find. And so it sounds magical. It sounds like the sort of thing that the new atheists would have a field day with, but that's not a wise interpretation of that saying. The proper interpretation is something more like a recognition of the way thought works. So imagine your plans didn't work out. Okay, now you sit down and you say to yourself, I'd like to know, even if the world was conspiring against me and my failure was 95% the fault of external occurrences and other people, what did I do that wasn't as good as it could have been? And where did I fail to look so that the probability of my failure was higher? Now, to ask that question, you have to want the answer. That's what it means to knock or to ask or to seek. This is no joke. It's like you have to want to know. And it's a very painful thing to do because especially if you had given it your all to the degree you were able, and you have reason to be bitter, you're going to be searching for the errors that you still made. And discovering your own errors is always extremely painful, right? Especially if they're errors that you're in love with. And so you have to be willing to strip yourself down. That's what humility means fundamentally. And then, but the advantage is, this is why it's so useful to listen to people. You might find out where you're stupid. And then you could stop being stupid. And so one of the reasons you confess your sins, let's say, is because you want to discover where you're insufficient. Now, it's painful. It's painful to encounter an impediment in the form of someone else's opinion that might show you where you're blind and ignorant, or willfully blind even. But the advantage to that is you can rectify the error, and then as you move forward, you're stronger. The ultimate ideal is also the ultimate judge, because the ultimate ideal is something against which you fall far short. And that might be so painful that you can barely stand it. But then what you do is you two things, I suppose, is you lower the ideal and you raise your estimation of your potential. And what do I mean by lower the ideal? Well, if you're comparing yourself to someone or even to a future self, and the gap is so painful that it paralyzes you, then you've created a dragon that you don't have the tools to master. And so what you have to do is you have to scale the dragon down to size. And you want to scale the dragon down to size until it's a size that you are willing to move toward, however small that is. Now, if you're here and your ideal is here and that gap is unbearable, then you reduce the gap and you reduce the gap. And you're going to have to do that anyways, because you're not going to move from where you are to perfect in one fell swoop, right? There's going to be incremental steps. So you have to fill in that hierarchy of progression with a high enough resolution representation so that you can start to move forward. And then you should be buttressed. There's another gospel comment that's very interesting. It's called the Matthew principle. And the Matthew principle is, to those who have everything, more will be given. And from those who have nothing, everything will be taken. Now, it's brutal because it implies that reality works like this. When you're moving up, you go like this, right? And that's pretty nice. That's a lot better than this. But when you're going down, you go like that, right? It's like downhill, cliff. Okay, so you want to avoid the downhill path. Well, if the uphill path is like this, which is like exponential, let's say, or geometric, then what that means is that it doesn't matter how big the first steps you take uphill are, even if they're trivial, even if they're shameful in their size, because you're so useless, that if you're disciplined in that, you'll speed up extraordinarily rapidly. And so that's the good news, you might say, is that you can take very small steps, even ones that might be shameful in their size, and you have to admit that to yourself. But once you get the ball rolling, it doesn't roll in a linear fashion, it rolls in a geometric fashion. And this is a really good thing to know because it can take the sting out of the realization of your own stupidity. There's a sin that's laid out in the Gospels. It's the sin against the Holy Ghost. and it's unforgivable. And people have been debating for like 2,000 years about what this particular sin is. But it's something like the pathologization of the instincts that orient you. Like if you sacrifice your relationship to the truth, you warp your vision, and then you can't see. And then one day it'll be dark and there'll be sharp things in the fog in front of you, and you'll wander right into them because you've pathologized your own vision.
Yeah.
You don't want to lie because you program yourself falsely, and then you automatically see what isn't there. And then, of course, the world will slap you in the face continually, and you'll think, oh my God, the world's such a pathological place. When the truth of the matter is that, no, you just keep running into things that you refuse to see. And then you think, well, the world's made of nothing but obstacles. It's like, well, you put the obstacles in your own path, and you did that by developing these complex, self-serving delusions, a story that you tell other people about who you are that isn't true. You're trying to lay out a map that bears no relationship to reality, and you keep wondering why you wander off the path and into a pit. It's like, well, how could it be otherwise? I've been reading the Gospel of St. Matthew. I'm writing a book at the moment called Who Wrestle With God, and one of the things Christ says to people continually is to not damage their vision, is to not put, that's the best way of putting it. Don't occlude your eye. You can see what's in front of you if you're willing to see it. And if you're willing to see it, many of the terrible obstacles in life, you can just walk around. But if you blind yourself purposefully to follow your own narrow, self-serving delusion, you're going to run into terrible things and terrible people and the terrible part of your own soul all the time. That's what you should be afraid of. And there is a very tight association between loving your enemy and being grateful in spite of the terrible things that occur in your life. I've been writing about the book of Job, and Job is a story of unjust suffering, fundamentally. God deems Job a good man, so we have it on God's word that Job is actually a good man, and then all hell breaks loose, partly because God makes a bet with Satan, which is, a hell of a thing to do, and says, do your worst. He's not going to turn on me no matter what you do. And so Job, despite his torment, he becomes very ill, he loses everything he has, his friends, he becomes ill in a way that's disfiguring. His friends come around and laugh at him and tell him that he's a bad man, and that's why all these terrible things have been happening to him. And it's brutal. And Job refuses to lose faith in himself. He says, look, I'm not perfect. But as far as men go, I've done what I should do, and I'm not being punished in some manner that's obviously related to my sin. It's more like the random play of tragic forces in the world. I'm not going to lose faith in myself no matter what. And I'm also not going to, his wife says, shake your fist at God, curse him and die. Because things have gone so badly for Job, she thinks that's all that's left to him, and he refuses to do that. So he maintains faith regardless of what's happened to him. And that's really the moral of the story of Job, which is that you are morally obligated to maintain faith no matter what happens to you. And there's a practical side to that. So imagine that God and Satan conspire against you. There'll be times in your life where it feels like that's happening. And then imagine that your reaction to that is to become bitter and resentful and hostile. Well, then whatever hell you're in, merely as a consequence of the confluence of tragic events, you have opened a whole other hell underneath it. The hell of bitterness and resentment and ingratitude. And that turns into the desire for revenge very, very quickly. You think things are bad just because they're bad. You wait till you see how bad they can become if you allow yourself to be corrupted by your unjust suffering, right? And so I do think that this is the most practical possible advice that can be given to people, which is that you are morally required to maintain faith, to aim up, and to treat other people the way you would want to be treated, no matter what's happened to you. There's another gospel realization, let's say, is the standards you judge other people by will be the standards that you yourself are judged by. And the reason for that is, well, how are you going to judge everyone else and not apply the same standards to yourself? Like, that's not going to happen, because you become what you practice, and you'll turn the hostile eye that you turn on others, you will absolutely turn on yourself. There's no way around that.
It sounds like, based on what you're reading at the moment, you're trying to grapple with religious texts, especially the Bible. Yeah. We Who Wrestle With God is the name of the book.
We Who Wrestle With God, which is that's what the word Israel means. Israel means we who wrestle with God.
And so,
it's very interesting, because it means the chosen people are the people who wrestle with God. And you might say, well, who wrestles with God? And the answer to that is, well, everyone wrestles with God. Well, why? Because you can't act without making moral decisions. Like, every step forward is predicated on a moral decision. And so we're all wrestling with God. Narrative abstractions are abstractions. But you could say, this is what an archetype is. An archetype is a narrative abstraction that's more real than the world, than the apparent world. It's behind the scenes. And the biblical corpus is a narrative. It's a hyper-real narrative. That's the right way to think about it. It's more real than real. It's more real than reality.
How could something that isn't the thing be more real than the thing?
Well, that's exactly the problem with abstraction, right? Is the idea of a church more real than a given church? Well, it is in some ways, because it encapsulates what's similar across all churches, right? So it's like a Platonic ideal. A category is like a Platonic ideal. Is it more or less real? Well, you could say that the reality, this is what Plato said, the reality is a dim shadow of the essence. The reality is less real than the ideal. And we certainly, and that's actually in some ways built into our perception. Like, we criticize the things that present themselves to us because they are poor reflections of the hypothetical ideal. You might say, well, the ideal isn't real. It's like, well, you could make the opposite argument, which is that the ideal is more real than the thing itself. And I mean, I can give you an example of these patterns. So in the story of Cain and Abel, you have two patterns of sacrifice. Okay, why is sacrifice an issue? The reason it's an issue is because people exist in a sacrificial relationship to the world. What does that mean? It seems to mean something like human beings are aware of their extended self. You know you're going to be around tomorrow and next week and next month and next year and 5 years from now and 10 years from now. Now it's less certain as you go out, but you do have the sense of yourself as something that stretches across the decades. Okay, and so what that means is that you have to conduct yourself in a manner that isn't merely immediate. You have to conduct yourself in a manner that will work across time. Now, how do people do that? They work. Work is a sacrificial gesture. So you work, by definition, virtually. Work is the sacrifice of the present for the future. I mean, maybe someone can come up with a better definition of work than that, but I don't think so. It's like you put in time and effort right now. It's something, even if it's something maybe not what you'd like to be doing at the moment, you put in time and effort because you believe, what the hell does that mean? You believe it'll pay off. Well, is that a contract with the future? Is it a covenant? Because the relationship that the biblical corpus insists characterizes human striving is covenantal. It's a bargain. The bargain is you make the right sacrifices and they pay off. That's the bargain. Now, you might say, well, that's just part of the social contract, but the biblical corpus insists that it's deeper than that. It's built into the structure of reality itself. And that if you got the sacrifices right, the future would be paradisal. One of the commandments, one of the 10 commandments is do not use God's name in vain. Okay, now people think that means don't swear. And it sort of means that. That's one of its like tangential meanings. But what it really means is, do not claim divine motivation for self-serving behavior, right? And that's performative compassion. So what you do is you elevate compassion to the highest place. So you make it your God, which is a big mistake, because whatever God is, he is not merely compassion. You elevate compassion to the highest place, and then you say, I feel sorry for people. And what that does is elevate your moral status to the highest possible place, right? It's completely unearned, because this is something J.K. Rowling got so accurate with her Dolores Umbridge character, right? Who's an absolute power mad
always
tyrant.
In pink,
with
had
little
the cats.
kittens, had the kittens on the plates. It's like this toxic sentimentality. I'm so nice. It's like, yeah, I'd like to stay away from you and your devouring niceness. And the Freudians knew about that in a very sophisticated way, very early, because the devouring mother, the Oedipal mother, is the shadow side of compassion.
The shallow pond of empathy, which is at the moment something which appeases people and does not cause them any discomfort immediately, is always prioritized, even if the net effect of that over the long term results in their suffering.
Absolutely.
It's the
that's
toddler.
exactly what the Oedipal situation is. It's the prioritization of short-term emotional comfort over medium to long-term thriving, right? Because the mother who kicks the child out of the nest says, this is going to hurt now, but the iterating consequences are positive.
Michelangelo's Pieta.
Right, exactly. That's right. And that's exactly right. And the moral of that story is that if you give up your children to the world, you will keep them. Right? That's the sacrifice of Abraham. Abraham is called upon by God to sacrifice his son, and he says yes, so he doesn't have to. Right? You have to offer up your children to be broken by the world, or you lose them. You undermine them. You destroy them. It's a very paradoxical truth. We were talking about patterns. Cain is the pattern of inappropriate sacrifice. He does everything second rate. He lies. He omits. He prevaricates. He pretends. He doesn't offer his best. Abel's the opposite. He offers his best, which means his light is shining on the hill, right? There's no hiding. He's giving it everything he's got. The covenant with God is that if you give it everything you've got, you will prevail. And that's what God tells Cain.
Which, to go through some of the threads from today, instinct, staying true to that instinct, honesty, saying what you mean, not prioritizing, avoiding someone else's or your discomfort in the short term in order to believe that this is something which is going to make you feel better over the long term. Well,
that's a kind of sacrifice right there, is that you're willing to sacrifice your short-term physiological and psychological comfort for a medium to long-term benefit. It's the essence of sacrifice, to offer this is something the atheists don't understand about the biblical narrative, is that the narrative insists that we live in a sacrificial relationship. It's the essence of humanity to live in a sacrificial relationship. It's like, well, is that true or not? Well, as you mature, your relationships are more sacrificial. It's less about what you, in your narrow sense, want right now, and it's more about what's good over the medium to long run, including other people. Well, that's a sacrificial relationship. Now, the covenant, and this is a matter of faith. It's the matter of the deepest faith. Are you willing to act out the proposition that the way to make the world reveal itself to you in its most positive guise is for you to adopt the most appropriate sacrificial relationship? Well, it's a big risk, isn't it? Because you have to give up everything. That's the deal. You give up everything that's low. Everything. Well, that's what the Christian passion is, because the Christian passion is an archetypal story, because Christ is the person who sacrifices everything. Thoroughly, 100%. And the biblical notion is that there's no difference between that and the descent of the God of the Old Testament into into the space of human reality. So God is elaborated as a spirit in the Old Testament. That's a way of thinking about it. Fleshed out, right, into the law and the prophets. And Christ presents himself as the embodiment of that. So imagine, here's a way of thinking about it. You can invite various spirits to possess you. That's what you do when you give way to rage. That's what you do when you give way to lust, let's say. You allow spirits to possess you. Well, what would you be like if you did nothing but allow the highest of spirits to possess you? Well, that's the question that's put forth in the New Testament. And part of the answer to that is, if you allowed the highest of all possible spirits to possess you, you would be able to confront everything that life could possibly throw at you. And that's what happens in the Christian Passion, because the worst that life can throw at you is the worst tragedy. And the worst tragedy is the worst death, the worst and most painful death inflicted on the least deserving person, right? That's the ultimate reach of tragedy. Okay, that's not enough. Christ has to confront that, and he has to confront malevolence. That's the harrowing of hell. So the idea is that to adapt fully to life, you have to allow yourself to be possessed by the Spirit that will enable you to voluntarily face unjust suffering and death and evil. Part of the moral that's embedded in the story of Job and in the Christian Passion is that you can master what you'll face. And maybe that's true. Maybe that's true. I mean, the clinical literature seems to indicate that it's true, because one of the things you do, if you're a competent clinician, is you look at what people are attempting to accomplish, and maybe that needs some retooling, but let's assume that they have a goal in mind that would work, right? You've talked it through with them strategically. They have a well laid out vision. Okay, now they're laying out the vision and they encounter impediments that stop them. And maybe they're impediments that make them afraid and paralyze them. And so then what you do is you decompose the impediment, just as we talked about earlier, until you find a way they can advance that constitutes a genuine advance that they'll actually do. So what you do is you take the problem and you narrow it until they'll face it. Okay, then they face it. Then what happens? They get more competent. That's what happens. And then they get better at facing all problems. So they don't just learn how to deal with that specific problem. They learn a lesson that generalizes across problems. They get braver. When you use exposure therapy, people don't get less afraid. They get braver. And that's way better, because braver moves from situation to situation. Okay, so the question is, here's the question. If you faced everything that was put in front of you, who would you be? Well, the biblical answer is you'd be a true son of God. That's the biblical answer. It's like, well, do you believe that? Well, it depends on what you mean by believe. Do you think that do you have a better bet than facing what's there? Well, you just have to be sensible about it for a moment. It's like, is your theory that you're going to adapt better using falsehood and avoidance? Because that's the contrary theory. You either face it, and you do that predicated on the faith that something in you will respond if you do, or you don't face it. That's it. Those are the options. If you don't face it, that's faith too. That's faith in the notion that avoidance and deception will suffice. A good mother upsets her kids a lot. Quit doing that. Why? Well, why? Why not just let your children do exactly what they want? When the answer to that is, well, first of all, it terrifies them, because kids actually want walls. They don't want to be in the desert doing anything they want. They want a walled space in which they have the optimal amount of freedom. So a person who truly loves someone else doesn't strive at all costs never to upset them. That's the devouring mother. If you love someone, well, that's the biblical quote, you chastise them. Well, what does it mean? It's like, look, if you love someone and they're doing something stupid and self-destructive and you can see it, it's incumbent on you to say, this is going to upset you, but as far as I can tell, you're doing something stupid and self-destructive. And then there's going to be a tussle about that, because they're going to say, well, who are you to judge? And that's a perfectly good question, is what makes you think you're right? And here's the reasons I'm doing this. And, these are the terrible experiences that I've had that have led me to take this path. And sometimes that can be really compelling. You meet people who are bitter and resentful, and then they tell you about their life, and you think, well, yeah. But then you meet people who've had just as terrible a life, who aren't bitter and resentful, right? And they're doing better. And so even if it seems justifiable, maybe even if it is justifiable, it's not justifiable. There's a scene in Genesis. God throws Adam and Eve out of paradise because of their pride, their sin of pride. They each have their own particular version of that sin, Eve's sin and Adam's, but they get thrown out of paradise anyways for pride. And God puts cherubs at the gates of paradise, and the cherubs, they're kind of these monstrous angels, terrifying figures. And they hold swords that are on fire, that turn every which way and burn. And you might say, well, what does that mean? And it means that, well, a sword is something that cuts away, right? A sharp blade. And fire is something that burns. And a sword that burns and cuts away. And a sword that burns and turns every which way is a burning sword from which nothing can escape. Okay, now, you want to walk into paradise. Everything that isn't worthy in you has to be burned and cut away. See, the logos in the Old and New Testament, the logos that creates the world, is the judging faculty that, what would you say, that separates the wheat from the chaff, right? And it's compassion in a sense, because if you're compassionate towards someone, you want what's best for them, all things considered. But that compassion, in the highest sense, can't exist without judgment, because the judgment is, this part of you isn't worthy to continue. And certainly that's what you're doing with your children. When you see them misbehaving, you think, not that. Something more sophisticated. Even with my little granddaughter the other day, she's very, very playful, and she's a very nice little girl. She's very playful and very fun and funny and not neurotic. And so she's a pleasure to be around. But she hasn't seen me for a while. And so she was poking me, getting me to chase her around and poking me. And she'd come up and give me a whack, And at one point she whacked me too hard. And she knew it. And I said, that's not fun. That's not acceptable. And then she stopped. But she was playing with that edge, trying to find out where fun is and, how hard can I hit Grandpa? She doesn't bloody well know. She kind of knows, but she needs to know exactly. Well, I can't let her get away with it, because then she's not fun to play with. She has to learn to come and give her grandpa a whack in exactly the way that elicits a playful response and that isn't annoying. And so there's a very... you might think, well, it's pretty harsh judgment to lay on a 5-year-old. It's like, no, it's not. I would like her to be the most fun kid to play with that she could be, right? And so I'm not going to pretend that it's okay when it's not. You want to get to the moon, that's right. You can't walk there, so it's a bad plan. You need something extremely valuable that you can move towards. Okay, so part of the reason that you establish a relationship with God, let's say, is because that's what sets the upper bound to your vision. It's like, I want things to be the best they could be. That's a vision of paradise. Well, that has to be fractionated into, your proximal decisions, but lurking behind that should be this continual movement towards, what would you say, a heaven that recedes as you approach it. That's a proper vision of heaven. A heaven is a place that's perfect and getting better, both at the same time. That's what music shows you, because a great piece of music is perfect, but it's just getting better as it unfolds. And you need that. This is part of the problem with a static utopian vision, something Dostoevsky criticized. If you gave people nothing but consummatory reward, he famously says, so that they can do nothing but sit in tubs of hot water, eat cake, and busy themselves with the continuation of the species, human beings would break that all to hell in a moment just so they have something interesting to do. As we make the world easier and easier, so this is perhaps part of the problem with the material plenty that's at hand, is that at some point, what becomes lacking is lack itself.
Yes, yes.
Right, yes, exactly. It's optimal deprivation. And if everything is delivered to you on a platter, it's like, what the hell are you even doing there? This happens in the story of Abraham. So Abraham, who's the father of nations, right? So Abraham gets it right. He has everything at the beginning of the story. He has rich parents. He's got nothing that he has to do. He's like 70 when the story opens. He's been taken care of hand and foot his whole life. And the voice of God comes to him and says, I'm the God of your ancestors, telling you, get out of your zone of comfort. Get out into the world. And Abraham's pretty old by this point, but for whatever reason, he decides that he's going to forgo the comfort for the adventure. And then as Abraham progresses, he makes the requisite sacrifices, each becoming more difficult as he ascends. And he adopts this pattern of relationship with the God that calls him to adventure that literally makes him the father of nations. And so you can even think about that biologically if you want. You might as well. People like Dawkins think reproduction is sex. And that's why he can talk, for example, about the selfish gene making itself manifest in sex. Reproduction isn't sex. Sex is a necessary but insufficient precondition for reproduction. Abraham adopts a mode of being, a sacrificial mode of being that establishes the optimal environment for his sons, who then establish the optimal environment for their sons and their sons and their sons. So you can imagine that what Abraham is doing, this is what the story means, is he's adopting a mode of behavior that works best, all things considered, across multiple generations. And he sacrifices everything to that. It's this incredibly expansive vision. Christ says in the Sermon on the Mount that to orient yourself properly, and it's often viewed as this hippie paean, take no thought of the morrow will take care of itself. God takes care of the sparrows, he'll certainly take care of you. It's like a hippie wet dream. That isn't the core of the message. The core of the message is very straightforward. Christ says, aim up to the highest thing you can possibly imagine. So that's the relationship with God. You put what's at the pinnacle, properly at the pinnacle, and you aim at that. And then you concentrate that, and it's that, and treating other people like you would like to be treated yourself. That sets the moral frame. Then you attend to the day and the cares of the day. It's like once you've established the proper moral frame, you pay attention to the day and you live in truth. And that moves you towards that destination. You have to have the orientation right. You have to be aiming up. But then it's just a matter of, what would you say, abiding by the truth. That's the logos that sets people free. And that's right. Christ tells his followers in the Gospels to store up treasure in heaven, not in the places that moths can eat and rust can destroy. Well, what is that? What is meant by that? Well, it's meant by it means the same thing that you just pointed to, which is that if you run yourself through a disciplinary process, so you accomplish something, maybe you don't attain the goal you were aiming at, but you accrue a new way of looking at the world and a set of skills. Well, if you just keep doing that, you have multiple ways of looking at the world and more skill. Well, that's your storehouse of treasure. The reason women use wealth as a proxy for attractiveness is because wealth is a proxy for competence. It's not competence because you can be rich and useless. Now, it's not that easy, but it can at least happen temporarily. But women use markers of wealth to assess competence. And the competence is the treasure, not the wealth. Because if you're competent, you could be thrown into the desert and you'll make it bloom. This is what happens in the story of Exodus when Moses encounters the burning bush. So he's just going about his business as a shepherd, and he's doing all right. He's got 2 wives. He likes his father-in-law. He's well regarded in this new country that he's in. He's left Egypt, where there's a price on his head, essentially, for killing an Egyptian who was tormenting one of the Hebrews. Anyways, Moses is just going about his business as a shepherd, which was a very tough job in those days. And this thing catches his eye, this glimmer, this gleam, and he goes to investigate. Okay, so what does that mean? It means as you're progressing through life, something will capture your interest. And in the story you just told, it's like somebody decides they're going to start going to the gym. There's something about becoming physically fit that calls to them, right? Which is an interesting thing, right? Because it calls to them. It's not even necessarily a decision they make. It's more like a possibility that makes itself manifest that's of interest. So they decide to pursue it. So they look into it more deeply. Well, so Moses approaches the burning bush, and he gets closer and closer, right? And a bush is a symbol of life, right? Like it's a tree of life. And a tree of life that's on fire is being, that's the life, the tree, and becoming, that's the fire, the transformation. So a burning bush is a symbol of being and becoming as such. Now, it's something that beckons. Okay, so now you pursue your physical fitness because it's called to you. And you concentrate more and more on it. You get more and more disciplined. But as you get more and more disciplined, you start to transform, right? And so your vision starts to change. Now, what happens to Moses is that as he gets closer and closer to the burning bush, he starts to realize that he's on sacred ground. So he's going deeper. The investigation is taking him deeper. So he takes off his shoes and continues to approach. He's still going down the same trail, right, pursuing this thing. And then the voice of God itself speaks to him from the midst of the burning bush. And that's what turns him into a leader. And so what does the story mean? It means that as you walk through life in your normal mode, things will call to you. And if you pursue them, they will take you deep. It doesn't really matter what it is that calls. What matters is that you pursue it, and you pursue it to the depths. And as you pursue it to the depths, you will become transformed. And if you do that without reservation, that will turn you into the person who frees the slaves and opposes the tyrants. And that is how it works. That's the call. And that can happen in any direction, virtually any direction. You just have to pursue it with sufficient faith. The Luciferian intellect is the intellect that wants to place itself in the highest position. And there's lots of people, smart people tend to be Luciferian because they think that their fundamental value is their intelligence. And they think that intelligence is the fundamental value. And then they're often very annoyed if they're very bright and the world doesn't lay itself out at their feet because they think, well, I'm so smart, everything should just be coming my way. Because they've prided themselves on that. It's like, well, and intellectual pride, well, that might be the cardinal sin. The Luciferian intellect is the intellect that wants to put itself in the highest position. It challenges God. That's what Satan is. That's what Lucifer is. Literally, in the Miltonian story, is Lucifer is the spirit who attempts to usurp God. That's what the communists did. That's what the fascists did. That's what we do when we build towers of Babel. And we can easily elevate the intellect to the highest possible place, especially smart people. They do that all the time. It's better to attend to what you don't know. With the death of God, many other things die, things you don't expect. And one of the things that dies when God dies is science, and no one expected that.
How so?
Because science as a practice is a religious practice. It's predicated on religious axioms.
Is it?
Well, you have to believe that there's such a thing as truth. You have to believe that the truth is understandable. You have to believe that understanding the truth is good. You have to believe that there is such a thing as good, right? So imagine, to be a scientist, you have to imagine that, first of all, that the world is comprehensible to the human intellect, but more, that if you investigate the mysteries of the material world, that will be beneficial, right? Those aren't scientific claims. Those are metaphysical claims. And that metaphysical claim is nested in a story. You know, and the Enlightenment types, they've portrayed the scientific revolution as something contrary to the religious substrate. And that's not accurate. That's a French revolution. That's a Luciferian intellect history. It's not true. The universities grew out of the monasteries. That's where the universities came from. And science, as a widespread enterprise, got its start in the universities. And they grew out of the monasteries. That's not questionable. Like if you go to Harvard or if you go to Oxford and Cambridge, it's just starkly evident. The layout of the colleges is a monastic layout. So the idea that there's some fundamental contradiction between religious belief and the scientific enterprise, there's nothing about that that's true. And part of the reason that we're losing the scientific enterprise right now is because we've unmoored it from its metaphysical substrate and it can't survive. If you're going to be a scientist, you have to put the truth above all else. Scientists are very rare. You have to believe in the truth to be a scientist. I think Dawkins believes in the truth, by the way. So he's an atheist, but he's much less of an atheist than he thinks. That's my impression. Lying scientists are atheistic or just malevolent. Dawkins is a truthful scientist, and insofar as he's pursuing the truth, and insofar as he believes that pursuing the truth will set you free, then he's walking down a path that's Christian to its core. Now, I know he doesn't like that idea, but he also doesn't like the fact that the scientific enterprise seems to be collapsing in terms of its, what would you call, reliability and validity everywhere. So